Hey guys, tonight we're going through every major drug category, starting with the moment people first encountered them, how it first felt, what people believed it was, and what that belief turned into over time. Because the first experience was never the full picture, it was only the beginning. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting with psychedelics. Psychedelics are substances that alter perception, thought, and consciousness in ways that are genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced them. They don't sedate you. They don't stimulate you. They do something else. They change the way the mind processes reality. Colors shift. Patterns emerge. The boundaries between self and world become negotiable. Time stops behaving. Some people describe it as the most meaningful experience of their lives. Some describe it as the most terrifying. Often the same person describes it as both. The plants and fungi that produce these effects have been on Earth far longer than humans have. When humans arrived, they noticed what these substances did, and for thousands of years, across dozens of cultures on every inhabited continent, they incorporated them into their lives with considerable care. Not casually, not recklessly, carefully. With ceremony, preparation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations about what worked and what didn't. Then that knowledge got lost. Then a Swiss chemist stumbled onto it again by accident in 1943. Then governments made it illegal. Now medicine is spending billions slowly rediscovering what ancient people already understood. The question worth asking is, what happens when people encounter these substances with none of that knowledge? No preparation, no context, no one who knows what's happening. To see the real impact of that, you need to spend one night in a small French town called Pont-Saint-Esprit. The year is 1951, August, southern France. The kind of town where everyone knows the baker knows everyone's business, the bread arrives fresh every morning, and nobody thinks twice about any of it. On the 7th of August, people started feeling strange. Not sick exactly. Strange. The kind of strange that doesn't have a name because the name hadn't been invented yet for this particular constellation of symptoms. People were seeing things, not vague shapes, specific things, vivid, detailed, insistent things that were absolutely not there. A man named Léonard Meunier was a postman. He had a route. He knew every house. On the 7th of August, he began seeing tigers in the road and had to be restrained by his family. He was 53 years old. He had delivered letters in this town for 20 years without once seeing a tiger. Another man became convinced his bed was on fire. Not wrong in the way a confused person is wrong. Wrong in the way someone watching a completely convincing hallucination is wrong. The bed looked like it was burning. He could see the flames. He could feel the heat. His family stood around him watching a man fight invisible fire, with no way to explain that the fire wasn't there, because explaining things to someone whose visual cortex has been taken over by a fungal alkaloid is not as straightforward as it sounds. A young boy tried to fly. He climbed to a high place and jumped, certain, not hopeful, not reckless, certain, that he would float. He did not float. He survived, with injuries. His certainty that he would float did not strike him as strange until afterward. Across the town, hallucinations, convulsions, people screaming in the street, people trying to describe their visions with the urgent sincerity of people reporting something real. Because to them, it was real. The hospital filled, the local asylum filled. Doctors arrived from nearby towns and stood in the wards looking at patients and then at each other. They had no name for what was happening. The bread was responsible, something in the flour from the local mill. But what? a chemical contaminant, a bacterium, some medieval plague returning from wherever medieval plagues go between appearances. It took decades to reach full consensus. The flower had been infected with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain that had caused identical outbreaks across Europe for centuries, that medieval people called St. Anthony's fire because of the burning sensations, that had caused entire villages to convulse and see visions and do things that looked, from the outside, exactly like demonic possession. The people of Pont Saint-Esprit had consumed, without knowing it, a concentrated natural source of ergot alkaloids. The same alkaloids that Albert Hofmann had synthesized in his laboratory 8 years earlier. The same alkaloids that the priests of Eleusis had been using deliberately, carefully in controlled doses for 20 centuries. The doctors had no name for what was happening. They still argued about it 50 years later. Here is the belief that the people of Pont Saint-Esprit didn't have. The belief that had been lost long before they were born. It sounds obvious in retrospect. Most beliefs do. For most of recorded human history, across most cultures that encountered psychedelic substances, the understanding was the same. These are sacred tools. They require preparation. They require context. They require someone who knows what they're doing. Used correctly, they reveal something. Used without context, they destroy. Not naive, sophisticated, refined across generations the way all practical knowledge gets refined, through experience, through observation, through the slow accumulation of what works and what doesn't. The most striking example sat 12 miles outside Athens. Every September, for roughly 2,000 years, thousands of people walked from Athens to Eleusis. Philosophers, generals, emperors, poets. The walk was 12 miles. The ceremony at the end was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, and what happened inside was secret enough that the penalty for talking about it was death. Almost nobody talked about it, which is either a testament to the Greeks' commitment to secrecy or to what they experienced in there, possibly both. What we know, initiates drank something called kaikeion, a barley drink mixed with something else, an ingredient guarded so carefully that it took modern chemists decades to work out what it probably was. The barley had been infected with ergot, controlled, deliberate, dosed. The same fungus that would destroy Pont Saint-Esprit in 1951. Not destroying anyone in Eleusis, though, because in Eleusis the priests knew what they had. Screened participants, 9 days of fasting and preparation, designed setting, guided experience, integration afterward. Every element that modern researchers now identify as essential to a safe psychedelic experience. The priests of Eleusis had built it 2,000 years before the researchers had words for any of it. Plato participated, Aristotle participated, Cicero described it as the greatest gift Athens gave to the world, the thing that taught him to face death without fear. Marcus Aurelius participated, Sophocles, Pindar. The men who built the intellectual architecture of Western civilization gathered in a building in Eleusis once a year, drank an ergot preparation, and had experiences they described as the most significant of their lives. Plato tripped, on purpose, annually, for decades. This doesn't appear in most philosophy curricula. The temples closed, the priests dispersed. The ceremony that had run longer than most empires simply stopped. The specific preparation of kaikeion, the exact strain, the dose, the method, died with the people who held it. We lost the recipe, and then forgot we ever had one. For the next 1,500 years, Europe's relationship with psychedelic substances was not sophisticated. It was terrified. Ergot outbreaks, the same fungus, uncontrolled, contaminating the grain supply, caused waves of mass hysteria across medieval Europe. People convulsed and saw visions and ran through villages describing things nobody else could see. They felt their hands burning from the inside. They danced in the street for hours without stopping, which is not something people normally do. And the church organised exorcisms, which also didn't work, because ergot doesn't respond to exorcisms. Ergot has also been proposed as a contributing factor in the witch trials of Europe and colonial America. Not the only cause, historians have argued about the trials for centuries, but the symptoms line up uncomfortably well. The accusers in Salem describing spectral evidence, visions, sensations, the certainty of being attacked by invisible forces match ergot poisoning with a specificity that's hard to dismiss. The geography of the Salem accusations maps onto rye cultivation in wet seasons. Wet seasons grow more ergot. Some of the people hanged in Salem were very possibly describing a psychedelic experience. The response was to hang them. Nobody in that courtroom was being deliberately cruel. They were operating with the tools available. They had a vocabulary for unusual experiences, possession, witchcraft, the devil's work, and they applied it. The person convulsing in the street and describing invisible attackers fit that vocabulary perfectly. There was no other vocabulary to reach for. The one that would have explained what was actually happening had been locked in a building in Eleusis for 2,000 years and lost when Theodosius closed the door. This is not sophisticated. This is the belief stripped of its context. The sacred tool without the ceremony, the knowledge, the preparation. Encountered raw by people who had no framework and reached for the only one available. The framework said, invisible forces causing visions and convulsions is witchcraft. Wrong. But they didn't know that, and the framework had worked perfectly well for everything it had previously encountered, which to be fair did not include mass ergot poisoning. The framework was built before ergot was a category anyone had. The framework had no draw for fungal alkaloid contaminating the grain supply. The drawer it had was labelled witchcraft, and it fit, and so they used it. What they knew was what they could see, and what they saw looked exactly like what the church said it was. The rediscovery happened in Switzerland, April 1943. Albert Hofmann was a chemist at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel. Meticulous, precise, thorough. The kind of man whose lab notes were perfectly formatted even when the contents were extraordinary. His handwriting had probably been approved by a typography committee. He had been working with ergot derivatives, synthesizing compounds from the same fungus, looking for something useful for circulation problems. Respectable work. Responsible work. The kind of research that leads to a modest pension and zero cultural upheaval. In 1938 he had synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, made a note, filed it, moved on. 5 years later he had a hunch, no scientific basis, just the kind of feeling good chemists sometimes get that protocol doesn't have room for. He resynthesized it. At some point during the process, a trace amount touched his skin. An hour later the lab started breathing, not metaphorically. The walls developed texture they hadn't had. Colours became unreasonably loud. Time stopped cooperating with his watch. He was a meticulous Swiss chemist, and he was experiencing something his lab notes had no column for. He went home by bicycle. Private cars were banned. Wartime fuel rationing. So Albert Hofmann, in the middle of the most significant pharmacological experience of the 20th century, cycled 3 kilometres through Basel, while reality assembled and disassembled around him, still obeying traffic laws because he was Swiss and some things remained non-negotiable. He arrived home, lay on the sofa. The ceiling did things ceilings don't do. 2 hours later, it stopped. Hofmann sat up, checked his pulse, and reached the conclusion that only a scientist would reach after what he'd just experienced. He wanted to do it again, on purpose, with documentation. 3 days later, Monday, because Hofmann respected weekends even when investigating cosmic consciousness, He took a deliberate dose, larger, intentional. It was not small enough. Within 40 minutes he turned to his assistant and said, with Swiss understatement that deserves to be in a museum, "I don't feel well. I must go home." The bicycle ride back lasted 3 kilometres and felt like crossing several geological epochs. A neighbour delivering milk appeared to Hoffmann as a demonic figure in a mask. She was completely fine. She was just his neighbour. By morning it had passed. Hoffmann walked into the garden. The world looked extraordinarily, specifically beautiful. Real in a way it hadn't looked the day before. The colours of things, the sound of birds, the specific texture of his own thoughts. He wrote in his diary that he felt he had been granted a glimpse of something ordinarily hidden. He was 57 years old and had spent his career in a laboratory and had never felt anything like it. He called what he'd found LSD. He sent it to Sandoz's medical department with a note suggesting it might be useful for psychiatric research. He had no idea he'd just rediscovered something humanity had already lost once. Sandoz sent samples to researchers with a cover letter that was essentially, "We don't know what this is. Please tell us what box it goes in." The researchers opened the packages. Several tried it on themselves first, in the tradition of science. The results were not what the forms had space for. A psychiatrist in Los Angeles gave it to artists and asked them to paint before and after. The before paintings were normal. The after paintings were more accurate somehow, in a dimension of accuracy that sober vision doesn't access. One man painted the same bowl of fruit 16 times. Each version went somewhere further. The psychiatrist filed this under interesting. He didn't have a better category. A physicist reported feeling with complete certainty that he had grasped the unified theory of the universe. He couldn't remember it afterward. The physicist had understood everything and lost it on the bicycle ride home. The clinical notes from this era are extraordinary documents. Trained researchers applying scientific language to experiences scientific language wasn't built for. Subject reported dissolution of ego boundaries. Patient indicated certainty of contact with universal consciousness. Experienced researcher noted that his usual clinical detachment had become unavailable. That last one was written about himself, while still on the drug. Third person, because first person felt insufficient. Nobody could agree on a category. Not a stimulant, not a sedative, not a hallucinogen in any recognizable sense. Someone proposed psychotomimetic, psychosis mimicking, which was wrong in ways everyone could feel but nobody could yet explain. They filed it there anyway. The form needed an answer. Then the clinical results started arriving. Alcoholic patients who had failed every available treatment, achieving sobriety after 1 or 2 carefully guided sessions. One of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous tried it and said it produced the same transformative experience that had started his recovery, in a fraction of the time. Terminal cancer patients reporting that the remaining weeks felt more real, more specifically, individually, irreplaceably real. One woman, 3 weeks from death, asked her doctor why nobody had told her about this sooner. That question deserved an answer. What it got instead was the government. The CIA got there first. 1951. The Soviets were allegedly developing mind control techniques. The CIA needed to understand mind control. The CIA looked at a substance that made a person's reality negotiable and saw, in the specific way institutions see things, a tool. They called the program MK Ultra. The idea, if LSD makes reality negotiable, perhaps it makes loyalty negotiable, perhaps it makes an enemy agent talk, perhaps it makes a person into something useful. The CIA was, in this period, quite enthusiastic about the word perhaps. What it actually did was give CIA agents the most significant experiences of their lives at extremely inconvenient moments. The experiments were elaborate, unethical, and operationally disastrous. Subjects were dosed without consent. Mental patients, prisoners, members of the public who had no idea anything was happening to them. Agents dosed each other at parties, then observed the results, then wrote up reports that read like the minutes of meetings nobody should ever have held. At one point, the CIA set up a safe house in San Francisco, hired sex workers to lure men in, dosed them covertly with LSD, and watched through a one-way mirror. CIA officers observed this while drinking martinis. Both the one-way mirror and the martinis are in the declassified files. A scientist named Frank Olson was dosed without his knowledge at a work retreat in Maryland. He had a severe psychological crisis. 11 days later, he fell from the 10th floor of a New York hotel. The official ruling was suicide. His family has contested it for 50 years. The case was partially reopened in the 1990s. It has not been resolved. What the CIA discovered, after 11 years of this, was that LSD did not produce useful tools. It produced people who were temporarily somewhere else entirely, and who sometimes came back changed in ways that intelligence operations have no protocols for. The program ran for 11 years. The files were ordered destroyed in 1973 by the CIA director, who presumably felt that the one-way mirror and the martinis were not going to play well. Most of the files were destroyed. Some survived in a financial records room by accident and were found in 1977. The contents confirmed that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had spent 11 years trying to weaponize Enlightenment, had failed, had harmed an unknown number of people in the process, and had then tried to make the paperwork go away. Meanwhile, Timothy Leary was at Harvard. Leary was a psychologist who'd encountered psilocybin in Mexico in 1960 and had the kind of experience that redirects careers. He came back to Harvard, started the Harvard Psilocybin Project, and began producing genuine clinical results. Measurable improvements in prisoner rehabilitation, in creativity, in the kinds of metrics academic institutions recognize as meaningful. He was also becoming impossible to manage. This is not a euphemism. Harvard tried several times. Harvard is very good at managing difficult people. Leary defeated Harvard. Leary concluded, not without evidence, that psychedelics were the most significant discovery of the 20th century. He was probably right about that. He also started conducting sessions at his house instead of the lab. He included his graduate students as participants rather than researchers. He began giving the substances to writers, artists and intellectuals who had no experimental protocol and no intention of filling out forms. He wore white. He gave speeches. He told an entire generation to turn on, tune in and drop out, which was excellent advice for a cultural movement and catastrophic advice for a research program trying to maintain regulatory approval. The research program was, at this point, producing its most significant results: the terminal cancer work, the alcoholism treatment, the carefully controlled studies being conducted by researchers who were not Timothy Leary, and who were watching what he was doing with the specific despair of people watching someone set fire to the thing they've spent years building. It didn't matter. Harvard fired Leary in 1963. He went straight to the public. He gave lectures. He wrote books. He became, in the specific way that the 1960s produced such people, simultaneously a prophet and a liability. Genuinely right about some things, genuinely reckless about others, and completely unable to tell the difference. Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America. Leary had business cards printed. He was delighted. The administration, watching a generation of young people take psychedelics and question the Vietnam War and authority in general, had found its target. The drugs were the mechanism. The movement was the actual concern. You couldn't make it illegal to be against the war. but you could make the drugs illegal. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act placed LSD in Schedule 1, no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. The same category as heroin. The category was called Schedule 1. It meant this molecule has no medical value and may not be studied to find out if it has medical value. The logic was airtight if you didn't think about it. This was not primarily a pharmacological decision. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, said so explicitly in an interview years later. The target was the anti-war movement, the counterculture, the people asking questions the administration didn't want asked. Make the movement's drugs illegal, you make the movement vulnerable. You don't have to say what you're actually doing. The clinical research stopped. The alcoholism trials closed. The cancer ward sessions ended. The woman who asked why nobody told her sooner never got an answer. The molecules went into a drawer. The drawer stayed shut for 30 years. Then, carefully, with years of paperwork and approvals from committees that had spent decades classifying these molecules as medically useless, a few researchers started opening it again. Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London. One study at a time, one committee at a time, each one requiring the researchers to prove to institutions that had enforced the scheduling that the molecules were worth studying at all. The irony of having to convince the people who made the research impossible that the research was worth doing apparently occurred to everyone involved. Nobody said it out loud. Committees don't do irony. Psilocybin for depression, for end-of-life anxiety, for addiction. In the depression trials, patients who had failed every available antidepressant, the treatment-resistant cases, the people the conventional system had run out of options for, were showing response rates that the conventional antidepressants couldn't match. Not in weeks, in days, sometimes in hours. MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. Results so strong that the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation, a status reserved for treatments showing substantial improvement over existing options, which the agency fast-tracks. The same agency that had enforced the scheduling for 40 years was now running the fast lane for the same molecule. The left hand and the right hand of the American regulatory system were not apparently speaking to each other. LSD for cluster headaches, called the suicide headache because of how bad they are, and because of what people do to escape them. Standard treatments work inconsistently, and when they fail completely. A single microgram dose of LSD, carefully administered smaller than recreational doses, produced months of relief in multiple studies. People who had been managing daily agony started having normal days, then weeks. The researchers were not starting from zero. They were picking up exactly where the research had stopped in 1970. The questions were the same questions the researchers from the 1950s had been asking. The answers were the same answers those researchers had been finding before the drawer closed. All of that time, all those decades, all those people who needed the treatment and didn't get it, because the scheduling made the research impossible, and the research being impossible meant the treatment didn't exist. The second category is actually two categories that humans have always treated as one. Stimulants and depressants. Stimulants speed things up. They sharpen focus, drive away fatigue, lift mood, make the impossible feel merely difficult. Cocaine, caffeine, amphetamines, methamphetamine. Different molecules, different intensities, same basic direction. Up. Depressants slow things down. They quiet pain, ease anxiety, soften grief, make the unbearable feel merely heavy. Alcohol, opioids, barbiturates, benzodiazepines. Again, different molecules, same direction. Down. The belief that formed around both of them was simple and felt completely obvious. These substances go in a direction and stay there. Up means more capable. Down means more at ease. The effect is the thing. The effect is the medicine. The belief was right about the first hour. It had no idea what the second hour was going to do. And the second hour, in both directions, was always doing the same thing. The body was adapting, quietly, without asking permission, preparing for the absence of whatever had just arrived. Let's talk about stimulants and depressants. Two things, but related, and the most widely used drug types in human history by some distance. Almost every person alive is using one of them right now. The coffee you had this morning, the drink you had last night, the pill that helps you sleep, the one that helps you focus. Stimulants and depressants are not exotic or unusual. They are the background noise of human civilization. Stimulants push you up. They increase alertness, drive away fatigue, sharpen focus, lift mood. They make the impossible feel merely difficult. At low doses, caffeine in tea, mild coca, they're gentle. At high doses, methamphetamine, pure cocaine, they're not. But the direction is always the same, up. Depressants pull you down. They quiet anxiety, ease pain, soften the edges of a day that's been too sharp for too long. Alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines. At low doses, a glass of wine, a mild sedative, they're calming. At high doses, they suppress the nervous system completely. The direction again is always the same. Down. Simple enough. Except the body doesn't stay where you put it. Which is what every person who ever used either of these discovered, eventually, and what nobody seemed to warn the next person about. Let's start with up. Stimulants. The oldest stimulant story isn't cocaine, it's a leaf. Picture this. You are a runner in the Andes, 15,000 feet above sea level. The air is thin, genuinely physically thin, the kind that makes your lungs work twice as hard for half the result. Your legs are heavy. Your head aches from the altitude. You have a message to deliver on a mountain between you and the person who needs it. Someone hands you a small bundle of leaves. You tuck them into your cheek with a pinch of ash, the way you've been taught, and you start walking. Within 20 minutes, the headache recedes. Your breathing eases. The hunger that was gnawing at your stomach quiets. Your legs still hurt, but the hurt feels distant, manageable, something you can work through rather than something working through you. The mountain is still there. You're still climbing it. But the mountain has become slightly less personal about the whole thing. That is the coca leaf. Not a high, not a rush, just the gap between what your body can do and what it needs to do quietly closed. For at least 8,000 years, people in the Andes chewed coca leaves exactly like this. Not extracted, not concentrated. Leaves, mixed with a pinch of ash, chewed slowly over the course of an hour. The Inca Empire built its road system partly on the backs of runners who covered hundreds of miles of mountain terrain, fueled, in part, by coca. Calibrated, purposeful, 8,000 years without a crisis. Then, in the 1850s, a German chemist named Albert Niemann isolated the active compound. He called it cocaine. He noted in his lab notebook that it produced a numbness of the tongue when tasted. He was the first person to taste pure cocaine and survive writing about it, which is a distinction he probably didn't appreciate at the time. The compound sat in vials, promising but purposeless, a solution looking for a problem. It found several. In 1863, an Italian Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani had an idea. He mixed coca extract with wine. The resulting product, Vin Mariani, became the most celebrated tonic of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria drank it. Ulysses Grant drank it while dying of throat cancer and said it eased his pain and allowed him to keep writing his memoirs. Thomas Edison drank it and credited it with allowing him to work longer hours, which is either a product testimonial or an indictment of Edison's work-life balance, depending on your perspective. Jules Verne, Henrik Ibsen, Emile Zola, all endorsers, all enthusiastic. And then, Then, Pope Leo XIII awarded Angelo Mariani a Vatican Gold Medal. The sitting Pope of the Catholic Church gave a coca wine manufacturer an official endorsement, sat for a portrait. The portrait was framed and displayed in Mariani's office, and appeared in his advertising. The Vatican had officially endorsed cocaine wine. This was not considered unusual. Meanwhile, in Vienna, a young neurologist named Sigmund Freud obtained a sample of pure cocaine in 1884 and had, by his own account, a deeply satisfying experience. He wrote a paper called Über Coca recommending it for depression, fatigue, morphine addiction, and indigestion. He gave it to his fiancée. He gave it to friends. He took it himself with what his letters describe as considerable enthusiasm. He gave it to a colleague named Ernst Fleischl von Marxow, who was struggling with morphine addiction and the chronic pain that had produced it. The colleague stopped using morphine. The colleague developed a cocaine addiction, severe, rapidly escalating, requiring doses that dwarfed what Freud had recommended. Within a year, Fleischl von Marxow was spending the equivalent of a doctor's annual salary on cocaine. He died 7 years later, at 45, having spent the intervening period in a condition his friends described as worse than what the morphine had produced. Freud noted this. He wrote about it. He did not update the paper's conclusions. At roughly the same time in Atlanta, a pharmacist named John Pemberton invented a drink he called Coca-Cola. The original formula contained cocaine, not traces, a meaningful amount, absorbed through the stomach, producing what the marketing described as refreshing invigoration, and what the pharmacology described as a mild cocaine effect. People liked it enormously. They really did feel better after drinking it. That was the cocaine. The drink remained on the market with its original formula until 1903, when the cocaine was quietly removed and replaced with additional caffeine. The product still worked. The refreshing sensation remained, possibly because caffeine is also a stimulant, which should have prompted some reflection about what refreshing actually meant, but didn't. The company kept the name, kept the distinctive taste, kept the marketing about invigoration and satisfaction. They removed the part that was doing the invigoration and replaced it with a different part that did similar invigoration. Nobody called this dishonest. Here is what cocaine and caffeine and every stimulant that followed actually does to the body. Because this is the part nobody explained at the time, and the part that kept producing the same surprise decade after decade. Stimulants flood the brain's reward and alertness systems with more signal than they normally receive. The brain, being a highly efficient pattern recognition system, responds to this not with gratitude but with adaptation. It downregulates, reduces its sensitivity, returns the baseline to normal even with the drug present. The brain doesn't do this to be difficult. It does this because it is very good at its job. The job, unfortunately, is returning things to normal, not keeping things at pleasant. The brain has never heard of pleasant. The brain has a set point and it is going back to it. And when the drug leaves, the baseline reasserts itself against a brain recalibrated for more signal than it's now receiving. The gap is experienced not as chemical adjustment but as suffering. Specific, physical, urgent suffering that has one obvious solution. That's the crash. It's not a side effect. It's not a character flaw. It's arithmetic. The inevitable consequence of a system that adapted, now running on a gap. The Victorians didn't know this. Nobody told them. When patients taking cocaine for depression became worse when they stopped, doctors assumed the depression had returned. When the dose needed to increase to produce the same effect, they assumed the condition had worsened. The correct explanation wasn't in any textbook. It wasn't named yet. It was just happening, to everyone, quietly, and then less quietly. Now depressants. Opioids also go down. Morphine, heroin, codeine are depressants too, technically. but their story is so specific and so consequential that it gets its own conversation. What we're covering here is the sedative family, the things that quieted the mind: alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, the drugs that humans and medicine kept reaching for every time anxiety and sleeplessness needed solving. Before any of that history, imagine this. You are exhausted, not tired. Exhausted. The kind that sits in the bones. The harvest was hard, the winter is coming, someone in the family is sick, and the worry doesn't stop when the sun goes down. It follows you into the dark. Your body is still, but your mind won't be. 3 hours until dawn and you haven't slept. This is not a modern problem. This is the oldest problem. This is the thing humans have always needed something to fix. Now someone hands you a clay cup. Fruit that fermented too long. Grain that sat in water and became something else. You drink it, and the noise goes quiet. Not gone. Just quieter. The worry is still there, but it's moved to a different room. Your shoulders drop half an inch. Your jaw unclenches. The dark feels less like a threat and more like just the dark. That is why alcohol exists. That is why every civilization found it. Not because humans are weak, because that feeling, that specific physical relief of a mind that finally stops grinding, is one of the most sought-after experiences in human history. Start with alcohol. Because alcohol is where it all began. Humans discovered fermentation independently on at least 3 separate continents. Not by accident exactly, by persistent, curious experimentation with fruit and grain and time. The kind of experimentation that suggests people were motivated. The oldest known alcoholic beverage dates to around 7000 BC in China. Ancient Egypt brewed beer industrially. The Greeks had wine gods. The Romans had wine infrastructure. Every civilization that has ever existed has found a way to make something ferment and then drunk it with enthusiasm. This tells you something. The desire to quiet the mind, soften anxiety, make grief temporarily manageable. This is not a weakness or a modern pathology. It is one of the most consistent things humans have ever done. Alcohol worked, genuinely, reliably, for thousands of years. It reduced anxiety. It made social situations manageable. It turned strangers into temporary friends and enemies into temporary allies. It made the unbearable feel, for a few hours, merely heavy. Then America decided to ban it. Prohibition began in 1920. The 18th Amendment, nationwide. The most confident attempt to solve alcohol by removing it. If the drug causes harm, remove the drug. Remove the harm. Simple. Clean. The kind of policy that looks airtight until you try to implement it across a country of 100 million people who have been drinking for their entire lives and see no particular reason to stop. They stopped going to bars. They started going to speakeasies. There were more speakeasies in New York after Prohibition than there had been bars before it. The law had not reduced drinking, it had added a door to it. What else followed was 13 years of organised crime, bathtub gin, corruption of law enforcement at a scale that would take decades to undo, and the creation of criminal networks that would define American organised crime for the rest of the 20th century. The alcohol didn't go away. It went underground. It became more dangerous, unregulated, uncontrolled, occasionally lethal when the distillation went wrong. Removing supply did not remove demand. It just changed where demand went to find its supply. Prohibition ended in 1933. The lesson was clear. You cannot ban something this embedded in human culture. The drug had been there longer than the government. The government blinked first, but the pharmaceutical industry had been watching. If alcohol was too embedded to ban, perhaps there was a cleaner version of the same feeling. Something more precise, more medical, something you could prescribe rather than brew. The history of sedatives is a history of the same discovery made repeatedly by different people in different decades who had apparently not spoken to the people from the previous decade. Chloral hydrate in the 1860s, the first synthetic sedative, effective and fast, so popular it became the original knockout drop slipped into drinks, which tells you something about how quickly sedatives find uses nobody planned for. It worked until it didn't, until the dependency became visible, until the next thing arrived. Barbiturates in the early 20th century. Veronal, luminal, a whole family of compounds that the pharmaceutical industry produced with genuine confidence that this time the mechanism was clean and the risks were understood. Prescribed for anxiety, for insomnia, for the ordinary distress of daily life. They worked. They also had a gap between a sleeping dose and a lethal dose that was uncomfortably narrow, which the prescribing guidelines mentioned and the reality of the medicine cabinet made immediately dangerous. Marilyn Monroe died from barbiturate overdose in 1962, so did Jimi Hendrix in 1970, Judy Garland in 1969. The list is long and recognizable, and every name on it was prescribed these drugs by a doctor who believed they were helping. The pharmaceutical industry responded to the barbiturate problem the way it always responds, by finding something better. Benzodiazepines, Valium, launched in 1963, Librium, Xanax. A class of drugs that targeted anxiety with more precision than barbiturates, with a wider safety margin, with the confidence of a pharmaceutical industry that had genuinely learned something from the previous generation's mistakes. Valium became the most prescribed drug in the world by 1968. Not because doctors were reckless, because it worked. Because anxiety is real and the drug relieved it. The housewives of the 1960s and 70s received Valium at rates that prompted the Rolling Stones to write a song about it. Mother's Little Helper, released in 1966, which is either a sharp piece of social commentary or the most specific drug advertisement in rock history, depending on how you listen to it. The dependency that benzodiazepines produced turned out to be among the most stubborn of any drug class. Not dramatic in the way heroin withdrawal is dramatic. Not acute, not immediately life-threatening. Just persistent. Patients who had taken Valium for years and tried to stop found the anxiety returning, amplified, demanding. The drug that had quieted the anxiety had, over time, made the anxiety its own best argument for continuing. Nobody was watching for this. Everyone was watching the first experience, the quiet, the sleep, the relief. The second experience was doing what it always does. Arriving anyway. In 1938, a German pharmaceutical company called Temmler released a new product. They called it Pervitin. The name sounded cheerful and vaguely health-related, like something your grandmother would take for general well-being, not like pharmaceutical-grade stimulant that would reorganize your brain chemistry in ways you'd later regret. The marketing matched the name. Advertisements showed smiling housewives with perfect hair, managing impossible households with evident joy. Energetic factory workers who appeared thrilled about 12-hour shifts. Students studying deep into the night with expressions of contentment rather than the appropriate existential dread. The product was methamphetamine, available at pharmacies, no prescription needed. Recommended for depression, fatigue, lack of motivation, and what the marketing described as general dissatisfaction with reality, which is perhaps the most accurate description of what methamphetamine treats that has ever appeared in an advertisement, because it is absolutely dissatisfied with your reality and very enthusiastic about providing a different one. But here is where German pharmaceutical confidence reached its most extraordinary expression. Temmler also sold Pervitin in chocolate form, Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate, actual candy bars, methamphetamine-laced, sitting on pharmacy shelves alongside regular confectionery. There was a version for housewives, Hausfrauenschokolade, and a version for pilots, Fliegerschokolade, targeted meth chocolate marketing. Someone sat in a meeting and discussed the branding strategy for distributing methamphetamine to different demographics in candy bar form, and the meeting concluded with distribution agreements and a production schedule. Within a year of release, Pervitin was everywhere in Germany. Pharmacists recommended it like aspirin. Doctors prescribed it freely, with the confidence of people who definitely knew what they were doing. The medical establishment looked at mass methamphetamine consumption and thought, this is fine. Science has delivered a miracle. Questioning miracles is for pessimists. Then the Wehrmacht looked up from the pharmacist's recommendation and saw something useful. The German military began systematic testing of Pervitin in 1939. This was not a covert program. Military doctors conducted official studies with paperwork and documentation, carefully measuring how the drug affected soldiers' performance, endurance, aggression, and willingness to charge into situations that sober people would recognize as bad ideas. The results were exactly what happens when you give methamphetamine to young men and measure their capacity for sustained activity and reduce self-preservation instinct. Soldiers could march longer, fight harder, stay awake for days. The drug appeared to create the perfect fighting machine. Tireless, fearless, absolutely convinced of their own invincibility, even when all available evidence suggested otherwise. This is, it turns out, not the same thing as being invincible. The evidence was not consulted. By 1940, Pervitin was standard issue for the Wehrmacht. Not optional, not for special circumstances. Standard issue, like helmets and boots, except helmets and boots don't create physical dependency or alter brain chemistry. Somewhere in the German military apparatus, a quartermaster managed Pervitin supplies with the same bureaucratic efficiency applied to ammunition. Requisition forms, distribution logs, supply chains, official paperwork for industrial-scale methamphetamine distribution. Future historians found these documents and had to spend a moment processing the surreal reality of what they were looking at. The invasion of France in spring 1940 was partly powered by this. The Blitzkrieg, soldiers who didn't seem to need sleep, who kept advancing when stopping seemed the only rational option, was not entirely tactical genius. It was partially chemistry. The Allies were, in a meaningful sense, losing early battles to an army on meth. In the short term, the advantage was real. Then the debt arrived. Debt always arrives. The soldiers who had stayed awake for 4 days on chemical willpower eventually stopped being able to stop. The baseline had moved. The brains recalibrated for stimulant levels they were no longer receiving experienced the gap as emergency, not as tiredness, not as a signal to rest, but as something indistinguishable from the body shutting down. Soldiers developed what the military carefully didn't call addiction. They called it dependency, or habituation, or increased tolerance, as if a different label changed the underlying pharmacology. It didn't. Paranoia emerged in soldiers who had been awake too long on drugs that suppressed the instinct to stop. Judgment became unreliable in ways that didn't appear in official casualty reports. Units that had seemed unstoppable in May revealed themselves by winter to be running on a resource that was destroying the machine it was supposed to fuel. Field commanders reported that soldiers were becoming erratic, aggressive toward each other, unable to sustain the clarity that the drug had initially provided. The Wehrmacht had distributed millions of tablets across its fighting force and was now managing an army with a dependency it had created, couldn't measure, and had no protocol for treating. The paperwork that had once logged distribution with such bureaucratic precision had no equivalent column for what happened when the supply ran short, and the men who had been running on it discovered what their bodies felt like without it. The housewives couldn't stop either. Not dramatically, not in ways that drew immediate attention. The Hausfrauen Schokolade had produced in the ordinary households of German cities and towns a population of women whose bodies had adapted to daily methamphetamine. When the product became scarce, when the military's demands began crowding out civilian supply, the withdrawal was not metaphorical. It was physical, specific, indistinguishable from illness, not weakness, not a failure of character or discipline or the moral fibre that German culture placed such emphasis on. Just the arithmetic of a brain that had been given a new baseline and was now furious about losing it. The chocolate had been taken away. The brain had not forgotten the chocolate. Chemistry had promised control. Chemistry had delivered adaptation. America watched all of this from across the Atlantic. The lesson was clear. America decided to try anyway. The 1950s arrived with prosperity as an obligation and exhaustion as an embarrassing secret. Soldiers who had seen the worst of what humans do to each other were now expected to mow suburban lawns with visible enthusiasm. Women who had built aircraft during the war were now supposed to find profound meaning in the architecture of domestic spaces. The gap between what was expected and what was humanly possible was real, constant and exhausting, and admitting it was somehow unpatriotic. American pharmaceutical companies had a product, methamphetamine, rebranded, Disoxin from Abbott Laboratories. Sounds less like speed and more like a cleaning product your grandmother would trust, which was entirely the point. Methadrin from Burroughs' Welcome, practically clinical. Obertrol, which sounds like it should come with a tiny cape. Same compound that had run the Wehrmacht's invasion of France. Now available at American pharmacies, prescribed by friendly family doctors, marketed to housewives as a treatment for depression, fatigue, and what the advertising described as the specific exhaustion of modern life. The advertisements in medical journals from this period are extraordinary. Smiling women, organised kitchens, a visual language of effortless competence and cheerful productivity. Nobody's advertisement said, "We're giving you methamphetamine. Your baseline will move, and stopping will be very difficult." That would have tested poorly with focus groups. The diet pill era followed directly. Amphetamines prescribed for weight loss because they genuinely do suppress appetite. Prescribed to millions of women for years by doctors who believed they were prescribing a tool, who had seen the first effect, appetite reduced, energy increased, mood elevated, and had built their clinical practice around it. The women felt better, genuinely better, more energy, less hunger, the particular lightness of a body that had been given something it recognized as fuel. For a few months, it was everything the prescription promised. They cleaned the house and managed the children and made dinner and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that the gap between what was demanded of them and what they had to give had temporarily closed. Then the dose stopped working as well. Then the doctor increased it. Then the baseline moved again. Then stopping became something other than a choice. The second effect always comes. It came for the soldiers. It came for the housewives. It came for everyone who believed the first experience was the whole experience, because the first experience in this category was always designed to feel complete. It never was. It was just the part that got there first. The second part was always coming, quieter, slower, and considerably less interested in how the first part had been advertised. It didn't stop in the 1950s. It never stops. It just finds a new name and a new pamphlet and a new patient population that hasn't heard the previous version of the story yet. In the 1960s, amphetamines were restricted. The dependency had become too visible, the stories too numerous. The pharmaceutical industry responded the way it always responds, by finding a molecule close enough to work and different enough to market as something new. Ritalin arrived, methylphenidate, a stimulant acting on the same dopamine pathways as amphetamine, producing the same alertness and focus, described in the same confident terms, not for housewives this time, for children, specifically for children who had difficulty concentrating, sitting still, and completing tasks in the way schools required. The marketing did not mention that the previous generation of housewives had been prescribed essentially the same molecule for essentially the same gap between what was demanded of them and what they could produce. The children's brains were developing. The baseline moved in a developing brain the same way it moved in any brain. The research on long-term effects took decades to accumulate because the children needed to grow up first before anyone could measure what had happened to them. The prescriptions kept accelerating. By the 2000s, Adderall, amphetamine salts, the molecule that had powered the Wehrmacht's invasion of France, now in a capsule with a friendly name, was being prescribed to college students across America at a rate that would have been difficult to explain to anyone who remembered the diet pill era. Not for a disorder, for performance. The same gap. Different decade, different pill, same direction, stimulants, exactly where they had always been. The energy drink industry built itself on the same promise Vin Mariani had made to Pope Leo XIII. Not cocaine, caffeine and taurine and B vitamins, lower intensity, legal everywhere, sold at every petrol station and supermarket checkout in the developed world. Red Bull launched in 1987 with a slogan about giving you wings, which is essentially what Angelo Mariani had promised Queen Victoria in 1863. The marketing changed. The molecule didn't. Then came the sedative side's latest iteration, Ozempic, semaglutide. A class of drugs developed for type 2 diabetes that turned out to suppress appetite so effectively that the pharmaceutical industry pivoted. Not diabetes, weight loss. The same move the diet pill era had made: suppress hunger, reduce appetite, promise that this time the mechanism was clean and there was no catch. The early results were real. People lost weight, genuinely, measurably, significantly. The first experience was exactly what it promised. The questions about what happens when you stop, when the drug leaves and the appetite the body had been suppressing returns, recalibrated and insistent. Those questions are still being answered. The data is still accumulating. The second experience is still arriving for the first wave of patients who took these drugs for years, and then, for whatever reason, stopped. The pattern kept running. The next version was already in development. Stimulants pushing up, sedatives pulling down, the body adapting either way, the baseline moving, the second experience arriving. Every generation discovers this sequence for the first time. The sequence has been running for 2,000 years. Now we get to opioids. Technically they're depressants. They slow the nervous system, quiet pain, reduce anxiety. But the opioid story is so specific, so long, and so consequential that it gets its own conversation. Because opioids don't just go down. They go somewhere more precise than that. They find pain, the specific, insistent, relentless kind, and they silence it. Not by fixing whatever is causing it, by interrupting the signal, turning the volume off at the brain rather than at the source. For anyone who has lived with serious pain, that distinction matters enormously. Opioids don't make you better. They make you not feel how bad things are. For a few hours, the body's constant emergency broadcast goes quiet. And in that quiet, people can sleep, can function, can exist in a way that wasn't possible before. That is a genuine, significant thing. It is why opioids have been used for 5,000 years and why they're still used today. The relief is real. What nobody told anyone for 5,000 years across dozens of versions of the same drug is what happens when the relief ends. 5,000 years before anyone was writing pamphlets, the Sumerians had a name for the opium poppy: Hul Gil, the joy plant. This was not poetic license. Imagine a person in ancient Mesopotamia, a farmer, a soldier, someone whose body has been worked hard and is registering every hour of it. Chronic pain was not a modern invention. Backs gave out, joints inflamed, wounds refused to heal cleanly. The body had ways of making its complaints impossible to ignore. Then someone discovered what happened when you scored the seed pod of a particular poppy and collected what oozed out, dried it, ate it. The pain didn't go away, but it stopped mattering. The body was still sending the signals, the nerves still firing, the damage still there, but something between the signal and the suffering had been interrupted. A man who hadn't slept properly in months slept. A woman in the late stages of an illness that would kill her spent an afternoon not suffering. The joy the Sumerians described wasn't euphoria. It was relief. Specific, physical, immediate relief. They wrote it down on clay tablets. They incorporated it into their medicine. They passed the knowledge through generations with the pragmatic confidence of people who had found something that worked. They were right about what it did. The ancient world built up thousands of years of opioid experience without creating a crisis of the kind that would come later, partly because the methods of consumption at the time, chewing, smoking, dissolving in wine, produced effects slowly enough that the body could manage them. Then, in 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner did something that changed all of that. Serturner was working alone, in a small apothecary in Paderborn, doing the kind of careful, methodical chemistry that produces results too slowly to be glamorous. He was trying to isolate the active compound from opium, the specific thing that did the thing, not the whole plant, not the dissolved preparation, just the molecule responsible. He found it. He purified it. He tested it on stray dogs who went to sleep. He tested it on himself and 3 friends who experienced effects he described in his notes with a careful understatement of a man who had just taken 10 times his planned dose by accident and was trying to remain scientific about it. The friends were fine, eventually. The notes were extraordinary. The dose calculation was not revisited. He called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was, in the narrow technical sense, a genuine achievement. Pure morphine is roughly 10 times more potent than raw opium, precisely dosable, injectable. Doctors could administer a specific amount and predict a specific outcome. Surgeons could operate on patients without those patients dying from shock. Soldiers could survive wounds that would have killed them from pain alone. The American Civil War ran on morphine. Field surgeons carried it in their kits the way they carried bandages. Men who would have died in agony on the battlefield lived long enough to be transported to hospitals, operated on, sent home. Many of them went home addicted. Soldier's disease, they called it. Hundreds of thousands of veterans dependent on morphine they'd been given in the field, by doctors who were keeping them alive, doing exactly what medicine said they should do. The first mass opioid epidemic in American history was a direct consequence of treating pain effectively. This tool worked. The tool also did something nobody had a name for yet. By the 1880s, enough people had noticed soldier's disease that the medical consensus was clear. Morphine had a problem. The problem needed a solution. The solution seemed obvious. Find something less addictive. In 1898, a German pharmaceutical company called Bayer introduced a new compound to the market. You know Bayer? They make aspirin. They sponsor sporting events. Their logo is familiar and friendly and suggests reliability. In 1898, they had just created something that would become the most feared drug name in the English language, and they were proud of it. They called it heroin. The name came from the German heroisch, heroic. Their test subjects had reported feeling powerful, capable, elevated beyond their normal selves. The company felt this warranted a heroic name. The branding was confident and sincere. Bayer genuinely believed they had made something significant. They had. Just not in the direction they thought. The word heroin, the most feared drug name in the English language, the word that has appeared in more obituaries, more courtroom transcripts, more police reports than almost any other, was chosen because the people taking it felt heroic. This seemed reasonable at the time. It seems like something else now. The pitch was elegant. Heroin was diacetyl morphine, a modified form of morphine that crossed the blood-brain barrier faster and more completely. In the clinical tests Bayer ran, it suppressed morphine cravings. Patients given heroin stopped asking for morphine. A drug that relieved the dependency looked like exactly what medicine needed. Bayer marketed heroin as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. They sent free samples to physicians across Europe and North America. They published the clinical results in medical journals. The pamphlets were professionally designed and factually specific and completely wrong about the most important thing. Heroin was more addictive than morphine. Not slightly, substantially. The faster brain penetration that made it effective also made the dependency form more quickly and more thoroughly. The patients who stopped needing morphine began needing heroin instead, with a speed and intensity that exceeded what morphine had produced. By the time this was clear, by the time the letters from concerned physicians had accumulated into an undeniable pattern, by the time the emergency rooms and the courts and the streets had provided their own evidence, Bayer heroin had been sold over the counter at pharmacies for 15 years, available without prescription, included in children's cough syrups, used by millions of people who had been told by the most credible source available that it was the safe version. The United States banned heroin in 1924. The safe alternative had become the new problem. The solution needed its own solution. At this point, the pattern was visible. Anyone looking at the history of opioid medicine by 1924 could trace it clearly. Morphine replaced opium and was more addictive than opium. Heroin replaced morphine and was more addictive than morphine. Each replacement had been sold as the safer version. Each had become the next crisis. The direction of travel was consistent and had been consistent for over a century. Medicine looked at this pattern. Medicine tried again anyway. The decades between heroin's banning and the next crisis were not empty. Opioid chemistry kept advancing, driven partly by genuine need. Pain is real, and the need for effective pain relief is real, and partly by the structural momentum of an industry that had built itself around delivering relief and needed new products to deliver. Methadone was synthesized in Germany during the Second World War, when the Allied blockade had cut Germany's morphine supply. Not developed because anyone had learned anything from the previous substitutions. Developed because Germany needed a painkiller, and no longer had access to the one it had been using. After the war, methadone travelled to America and was adopted as a treatment for heroin addiction. A drug synthesized to replace morphine, now prescribed to treat heroin addiction, itself caused by a drug prescribed to treat morphine addiction. The chain was 3 links long before anyone counted them. Nobody counted them. Hydrocodone, oxycodone, fentanyl appearing first in hospitals in the 1960s, too controlled for street use, or so everyone thought. A family of synthetic and semi-synthetic opioids, each one developed by researchers who believed they had solved the problem the previous version had created. Each one was prescribed. Each one created dependency in the patients who took it long enough. Each time, the dependency was framed as a patient failure rather than a drug property, because the explanation that made sense was, the drug is the solution and the patient is the variable. If the drug was safe and the patient became dependent, the fault had to be the patient. Nobody had room for the alternative, that the drug's safety and the patient's dependency were not in contradiction, that both could be simultaneously true, that pain relief and physical adaptation were two sides of the same pharmacological coin. This framing would remain in place through every subsequent version, through OxyContin, through the lawsuits, through the congressional hearings, through the deaths. Then, in 1996, a company called Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin. OxyContin was oxycodone in a time-release formula. The time release was real. The pill did spread its dose over 12 hours rather than releasing it all at once. This was a genuine pharmaceutical innovation. The claim that Purdue built around it was not. The claim was, because OxyContin releases oxycodone slowly, it doesn't produce the rush that drives addiction. Therefore, OxyContin is not addictive. The addiction risk is less than 1%. The less than 1% figure came from a letter to the editor of a medical journal, not a study, not a clinical trial, a 5-sentence letter published in 1980 describing patients who had received opioids under strict hospital supervision for a few days. Purdue cited this letter in their marketing. They repeated the figure in sales calls. They trained a 1,000-person sales force to say it to every doctor they visited, in every state, in every office. The less than 1% became a fact through repetition. It graduated from a claim to a consensus without ever being tested. The sales force worked with the focused efficiency of people who'd been given a very simple message and a very large commission structure. They identified the highest prescribing doctors and visited them most. They sponsored conferences. They funded pain advocacy groups that produced literature arguing America was undertreating pain, which was partly true. Chronic pain was genuinely undertreated, and that the solution was more opioids, which was the part Purdue needed to be true. Prescriptions accelerated. Millions of Americans received OxyContin for back pain, arthritis, sports injuries, the ordinary conditions of aging and labour. Conditions that had previously been managed with physical therapy and over-the-counter medication. Conditions for which opioids had never been intended as a long-term treatment. The pill worked. In the short term, it worked very well. The grandmother who picked up her grandchildren and spun them around. The construction worker who went back to the job. The miner who sat through his daughter's entire wedding and danced at the reception. Their relief was real. Their gratitude was real. Then the 12 hours ended. What the time-release coating couldn't slow down was the body's adaptation. Take opioids regularly and the brain adapts. It downregulates its own opioid receptors. It recalibrates its baseline. After weeks or months of regular doses, the brain is no longer receiving relief, it's receiving maintenance. And when the dose ends, the brain's new baseline asserts itself, and the gap between that baseline and normal function is experienced as something indistinguishable from emergency. That's withdrawal, not metaphorically. Sweating and freezing simultaneously, bones aching from the inside, legs moving without instruction, which is where the phrase kicking the habit comes from, not from willpower or determination, but from the involuntary muscle spasms of a nervous system that has lost something it was relying on. A brain sending a single message on repeat: get the drug, get the drug, get the drug. The body does not care about the person's intentions. The body does not care that the person started with a legitimate prescription and followed the directions and meant well throughout. The body has one position: more. Patients who had been prescribed OxyContin for legitimate pain returned to their doctors, reporting that the medication had stopped working, that the pain was worse, that they needed more. Doctors, trained by Purdue's sales force, holding Purdue's literature, carrying the less than 1% fact in their head, responded with the available answer: increase the dose. The drug that was failing became the drug you needed more of. Someone in rural Maine figured out that if you crushed the pill, the time-release coating broke and you received 12 hours of oxycodone at once. Word spread the way word spreads in small communities. Fast, quiet, and everywhere at once. Emergency rooms began filling with overdoses. The dead were not who anyone expected. They were grandmothers, high school athletes, workers' compensation cases, people who had followed the instructions on the bottle until the instructions on the bottle became everything. Purdue received reports. Their representatives heard the stories. Their internal documents show they tracked what was happening with the precision of people who knew exactly what was happening and had decided to keep selling anyway. Richard Sackler, the family member most responsible for OxyContin's launch and most enthusiastic about its success, wrote an email as the deaths began to accumulate. He blamed the dead. They were reckless criminals, he wrote. Culprits. The problem. The people who had become addicted to a drug marketed as non-addictive were, in the family's telling, responsible for their own deaths. Not the sales force, not the 5-sentence letter, not the billion-dollar marketing machine that had spent years telling doctors that the fear of addiction was the real public health problem. The victims were the culprits. The culprits were still billionaires. The crackdown began around 2010. Authorities restricted prescriptions. OxyContin was reformulated to resist crushing. Pill mills were shut down. The logic was straightforward. Fewer pills meant fewer addicts. The supply was the problem. Reduce the supply, reduce the problem. This is not how addiction works. People whose bodies had adapted to opioids, who would be violently ill within 24 hours without a dose, didn't stop needing opioids because the pills became harder to obtain. They found other sources. Heroin had always been available, cheaper than pills per dose, accessible through channels that now suddenly seemed worth the stigma. The distinction between prescription medication and street drug, a distinction that had felt enormous and morally significant to people who had always thought of themselves as patients, not addicts, evaporated when the alternative was withdrawal. The suburban mother with the bad back met the street dealer. The construction worker with a knee injury discovered heroin stopped withdrawal just as effectively as OxyContin and cost a fraction of the price. People who had never touched an illegal drug in their lives were buying powder from strangers on corners because the alternative was lying on a bathroom floor convinced they were dying, which they were not, quite, but felt like. Heroin deaths began climbing. The cartels noticed. Mexican drug cartels are many things: brutal, ruthless, operationally sophisticated in ways that consistently embarrass the agencies trying to stop them. What they are not is inattentive to market conditions. What the cartels noticed was this: America had manufactured a population of millions of people physically dependent on opioids, and the legal supply had been reduced, and heroin was meeting some demand but had its own supply chain vulnerabilities. Poppy fields required land, harvests were seasonal, eradication programs were disruptive. What if there were a synthetic alternative? Something that could be produced anywhere, from precursor chemicals available through legitimate industrial supply chains. Something so potent that a profitable quantity could fit in an envelope. The something was fentanyl. Fentanyl had been developed in 1960 by a Belgian pharmacist named Paul Janssen, designed specifically for surgical anesthesia. 100 times more potent than morphine, which in a hospital context was a feature. Smaller doses, more precise control, faster onset, faster clearance. In operating rooms staffed by anesthesiologists with monitoring equipment and reversal agents at hand, it was and remains an essential medicine. It is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It genuinely belongs there. Outside hospitals, the potency that made it medically valuable made it lethally dangerous in a specific and novel way. A lethal dose of fentanyl is invisible, literally invisible, a quantity that cannot be seen without magnification. Mixed into heroin, or pressed into counterfeit pills made to look exactly like OxyContin, exactly like Xanax, exactly like any medication a person might buy from someone who wasn't a pharmacy. It produced overdoses in people who had taken the exact same pill from the same source the week before and survived. There was no reliable dose. There was no reliable concentration. The same batch could kill one person and leave the next person unaffected. People who were not opioid addicts died. Teenagers who took a pill at a party, not knowing it had been pressed with fentanyl. College students who bought what they thought was Adderall. People who had carefully avoided opioids their entire lives and took something from someone they trusted. The iron law of prohibition had delivered its usual result. Restrict a substance and what replaces it will be more potent and more dangerous. The ladder that runs from opium to morphine to heroin to OxyContin extends upward. Fentanyl is not the top rung. Carfentanil, a veterinary tranquilizer used to sedate elephants, 10,000 times more potent than morphine, has appeared in street supplies. The ladder keeps building itself. The direction is always the same. The fentanyl crisis killed more Americans in a single year than the entire Vietnam War killed in a decade. Opioids do relieve pain. This is real and it matters, and millions of people have genuinely needed them. That part was always true. It was wrong about what happens next. It was wrong 3 times in a row, with escalating consequences across 150 years of trying. There is a word for the thing that happens with opioids. Not habituation, not dependency, not the careful clinical euphemisms that the medical establishment reached for each time to avoid using the word that described what was actually happening. Not increased tolerance, not unfortunate attachment to the remedy, not reckless criminal behavior. The word is addiction. The word describes a pharmacological process, the brain's adaptation to a substance it has learned to expect, the withdrawal that occurs in that substance's absence, the compulsion to seek the substance that results from the gap between the brain's calibrated baseline and what it's actually receiving. Not a moral failure, not a weakness of will, not a character deficit that certain people have and others don't. A biological process that happens to most people who take opioids regularly for long enough, regardless of their character, their intentions, their social class, their education, or whether they thought of themselves as the kind of person who could become addicted. The Sacklers knew this. Their internal documents show they tracked addiction rates carefully. They had data, they had emails, they had researchers telling them what was happening in the bodies of the people buying their product. They kept selling. Every version of the opioid story, from Hulgil to morphine to heroin to OxyContin to fentanyl, avoided the word addiction. Each time, when the evidence arrived, it was translated into something less pharmacological and more moral. Dependency, abuse, weak constitution, reckless criminality. Each translation kept the drug looking like the solution, while redirecting its failures onto the people experiencing those failures. The consequences kept accumulating. 500,000 Americans dead from the OxyContin crisis, hundreds of thousands more from heroin and fentanyl. The largest drug epidemic in American history, created by people who believed they were practicing medicine, and by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and chose to do it anyway, and by a regulatory system that couldn't distinguish between the two until the bodies made the distinction unavoidable. The opioid story is the pattern story, the one where the same mistake is made in the same way for the same reasons across generations that knew what the previous generations had done and chose to believe this time was different. It was never different. It was always the same drug, wearing a new name, carrying a new pamphlet, being handed to a patient by someone who had been told, with complete sincerity, that this one was safe. The patient believed it. Why wouldn't they? Every previous patient had been told the same thing, and every previous patient had believed it. Because what else do you do when a doctor hands you something and tells you it's safe? You take it. You trust the system that produced it. You don't know that the system has been here before. Dissociatives are the strange one. Dissociatives do something that none of the previous categories do. They don't push you up or pull you down. They don't alter your perception the way psychedelics do. What they do is stranger than any of that. They separate you from yourself. The body stays where it is. The self, the sense of being a person inhabiting that body, observing what's happening to it, goes somewhere else. For a while, the two things that normally feel completely fused come apart. In a medical context, this is extremely useful. If you can separate what a patient feels from what the surgeon is doing to the patient's body, you can operate without knocking someone dangerously unconscious or leaving them awake in agony. Eyes open, breathing normally, vitals stable. But the person, in any meaningful sense, not quite there. The idea was brilliant. The execution produced some surprises. In 1956, a chemist named Harold Maddox at Park Davis Pharmaceuticals in Detroit synthesized a compound called phencyclidine. Park Davis ran it through animal trials. The results were exactly what medicine had been looking for. Animals went under cleanly, dissociated, pain-free, vitals stable. They recovered quickly with no apparent distress, no respiratory depression, no cardiac suppression. The compound did precisely what it was supposed to do, and nothing it wasn't. The company named it Cernil, from the Latin serenus, calm, peaceful, tranquil. They printed brochures. They prepared to change surgery forever. Then they tested it on humans. Then the patients woke up. The medical term was emergence reaction, a clinical phrase for something that was not clinical at all. Picture a hospital room in 1958. Routine surgery. It went fine. Vitals good throughout. The surgeon is pleased. Recovery should be the boring part. Instead, the patient wakes up screaming. Not from pain. The drug handled pain beautifully. The patient is screaming because they don't know where they are, don't know who they are. The room doesn't look like a room. The nurse doesn't look like a nurse. Something has gone wrong with reality in a way that nobody can fix by explaining it. Some patients woke up convinced they had died. Not dying. Dead. Certain, with a calm that made it worse, that the surgery had killed them, and this was some kind of afterlife. Poorly lit. With hospital gowns that didn't close in the back. Some couldn't recognize their own bodies. They could see their hands. They didn't know whose hands they were, like wearing a stranger's skin with no idea how to take it off. Some hallucinated entire worlds, detailed, insistent, hours of alternate reality playing out in full while the nurses tried to manage it from the outside. And here was the part that made doctors most nervous. No pattern. No way to predict who would react and who wouldn't. Same drug, same dose, same surgeon. One patient wakes up groggy and grateful, the next wakes up in a psychosis that lasts 2 weeks. A coin flip, patient by patient. They ran the numbers. Up to a third of patients had significant emergence reactions. That's not a side effect. That's a feature nobody had ordered. Surgeons started refusing to use it. Park Davis had built a drug that worked perfectly for everything, except the part where people had to come back to reality, which is, unfortunately, a fairly essential part of the surgical experience. They tried to fix it. Of course they did. There was money involved and a genuinely brilliant idea underneath the screaming. The concept, separating sensation from consciousness without suppressing either, was right. The molecule just needed adjustment. Park Davis tried everything they could think of. Lower doses. The reactions continued. Pre-medication with sedatives to cushion the landing. Some improvement, no solution. Screening for risk factors. They couldn't find any reliable ones. The drug didn't care who you were or how healthy you were or how routine the surgery was. A 19-year-old athlete and a 70-year-old grandmother could get the exact same roll of the dice from the exact same dose. The company spent years trying to make phencyclidine safe to bring patients back from. The company could not make phencyclidine safe to bring patients back from. This is not a criticism. The problem was genuinely hard. The drug worked perfectly on the way in. It was only coming out that it became a horror film. By the mid-1960s, Park Davis gave up on human use. The Serenity drug was officially too terrifying for the species it was designed to sedate. Here is the part of the story that should be a footnote but isn't. Animals were fine. Not just fine. Genuinely untroubled. Monkeys, dogs, cats, horses, whatever the emergence reactions were, they appeared to be a specifically human problem. Every other mammal that received phencyclidine simply woke up and went back to being an animal. No screaming, no identity confusion. No hours spent convinced they had visited a dimension that didn't exist. The only species self-aware enough to notice it had been somewhere unusual, was the only species that couldn't handle coming back. In 1967, Park Davis rebranded the drug for veterinary use. New name, Sernilan. Same molecule, different patients. The drug that had been exiled from human medicine was now putting horses under for surgery, and the horses didn't mind at all. The newspapers would later describe phencyclidine as an animal tranquilizer. Technically accurate in the way that calling a fired employee a freelancer is technically accurate. The drug wasn't made for animals. It was made for humans and had failed, specifically and catastrophically, at the part of being a human drug that involves coming back to being human afterward. It was exiled to animals. The story should have ended there. Stevens was good at his job, in the specific way chemists are good at their jobs, methodically, without drama, with complete focus on the molecule rather than the cultural legacy it was about to produce. In 1962, he synthesized a new compound. Structurally, it was phencyclidine's smaller sibling. Same basic family, same mechanism, but shorter acting, less intense, dialed down. Like someone had taken the original, sanded off the sharp edges, and installed a timer that brought the patient back in 45 minutes instead of 4 hours. They tested it on animals. The animals recovered without apparent distress. Then they tested it on prisoners, because it was the 1960s and that was apparently considered an acceptable research methodology. And the prisoners reported feeling disconnected, floating, slightly strange, and when it wore off they simply came back. Confused, a little dizzy, but not screaming. The researcher leading those trials was a pharmacologist named Edward Domino. He needed a name for the state the drug produced. Patients seemed awake but utterly disconnected from their surroundings. Not unconscious, not conscious. Something without a word in any existing medical vocabulary. He mentioned the problem to his wife Toni over dinner. He described the patients, how they seemed cut off from themselves, floating in some private limbo between here and elsewhere. Toni listened and said, "They sound dissociated. Call it dissociative anesthesia." The drug got a less poetic name, ketamine, cobbled from its chemistry. Scientists are not known for their branding, but the category had a name now, and the drug had a function. The FDA approved ketamine in 1970. The same medical establishment that had recoiled from phencyclidine in horror embraced its child without hesitation. Ketamine went into operating rooms, emergency departments, and war zones. Vietnam needed a battlefield anesthetic that worked without a hospital. Ketamine was that drug. Difficult to fatally overdose on, didn't suppress breathing, worked fast, wore off cleanly. The World Health Organization put ketamine on its list of essential medicines. Not useful medicines, essential. The same list as insulin, as morphine, as antibiotics. The short list of things every hospital on Earth should have on hand. Phencyclidine's child, on the same list as insulin. while phencyclidine sat in a different category entirely. Same family, same lab, same decade. One became essential, the other became something different, something that would take a specific turn in the mid-1970s that nobody had predicted. Here is something worth sitting with before the street mythology arrives. In the late 1990s, the rave scene discovered ketamine. It spread the way all party drugs spread. Someone tried it, told someone, that person told someone, and within a few years it had acquired names. K, Special K, Vitamin K. People took it in nightclubs and at music festivals and in the same bathroom, stalls where they took everything else. The effects were described in a specific vocabulary. You got wobbly, things got strange. If you took enough, you went into a K-hole, which is exactly what it sounds like, a hole you fall into and have to wait to climb out of. Full dissociative anesthesia, consciousness relocated to somewhere outside the body, entities, tunnels, the conviction, for an hour, that you had left the physical world behind. This was the same pharmacological experience that phencyclidine produced. But nobody called ketamine a monster. Nobody built a mythology around ketamine users being impervious to pain. Nobody trained police officers to respond to suspected ketamine intoxication with maximum force. Nobody wrote newspaper stories about ketamine turning ordinary people into something inhuman. Ketamine had club kids giggling about stairs becoming a philosophical problem. Phencyclidine had front-page stories about the drug that made men into monsters. Same family, same mechanism, same basic experience, different story. The difference wasn't pharmacological. It was which communities each drug moved through and which stories those communities generated in the press, and how those stories entered the training materials of institutions that never went back to check whether any of it was true. Branding. That's what separated essential medicine from a permission slip. The story you told about a drug was more powerful than the drug. The story always was. Phencyclidine left the hospital the way most interesting chemicals leave the places they were designed for. Someone found it outside and decided to try it. By the mid-1970s, phencyclidine was on streets across America, smoked, snorted, absorbed through the skin in cigarettes dipped in liquid solutions. It had acquired a name that bore no relationship to its pharmacology, angel dust. The name came from the powder form, white and fine, but it carried something else too, a faint suggestion of the uncanny, of something that crossed a boundary it shouldn't. Around that name, a mythology was building. The mythology said, phencyclidine gives people superhuman strength, makes them impervious to pain, makes them impossible to restrain, makes ordinary people into something that requires extraordinary force to stop. Newspaper stories, police reports, court testimony, television crime dramas where the character on phencyclidine had to be established early in the episode so the audience would understand why what followed was necessary. Each account confirming what the others had established, all of them drawing from the same pool of unchecked assumptions that nobody had traced back to any actual pharmacological evidence. A man on phencyclidine required 8 officers to subdue. A woman on phencyclidine broke through a locked door. Someone on phencyclidine couldn't be stopped by a taser, by pepper spray, by a baton. The stories accumulated across a decade of reporting until they hardened into fact. Not pharmacological fact. The research said something completely different. But social fact. The kind that shapes policy and training, and what happens in the 4 seconds before a situation becomes a crisis. Police academies built training around it. Officers were taught that suspected phencyclidine intoxication required immediate maximum force, because the alternative was attempting to restrain someone who couldn't feel pain, which the mythology had established as physically impossible to manage through ordinary means. The training was built from the mythology. The mythology was built from stories, The stories were not built from the research. Nobody in the chain had checked. Edward Domino was still publishing research during all of this. Careful, methodical, peer-reviewed papers that had almost no audience outside of pharmacology departments and the small community of researchers who were actually measuring what phencyclidine did rather than what people believed it did. The research was available. It was correct. It was being ignored with remarkable consistency by everyone in a position to act on it. Domino published. The Academy trained. The papers explained the mechanism. The training created the crisis the papers were explaining. This continued for decades. What his research showed was this. Phencyclidine's effects were wildly variable. Dose mattered. Body weight mattered. Mental state mattered enormously. More than any other variable. Two people could take the same amount from the same source in the same hour and have completely different experiences, one floating, peaceful, strange, the other spiraling into confusion and fear. But the variable that predicted the worst outcomes most consistently wasn't the dose, or the source, or the individual's body weight. It was the environment. A person on phencyclidine in a calm, quiet setting almost always had a calm experience. Dissociative, absolutely. Strange by any definition. But manageable, they floated. They experienced things that weren't there, and they came back. A person on phencyclidine suddenly surrounded by shouting, grabbed by multiple people, physically restrained, dramatically different outcome. The drug removes the body's ability to process what's happening to it. Terror and confusion amplify each other. The person's body responds with the only tool it has left, undirected physical resistance, which gets interpreted as superhuman aggression, which triggers more force, which produces more terror, which produces more resistance. The mythology's monster was being created by the response to the mythology. Domino's research was clear about this. It was published. It was available. The research had been sitting there for years, explaining what was happening and why, and nobody in the institutions building the training was reading it. The mythology had arrived first. The mythology was more useful. In March 1991, a man named Rodney King was pulled over on a highway in Los Angeles after a car chase. The officers who responded believed he was on phencyclidine. He was moving in ways that suggested intoxication. He seemed to keep getting up after being struck, which the training had established as a characteristic indicator of phencyclidine intoxication. The training said, if someone keeps getting up, you have not yet applied enough force. A neighbour with a camcorder filmed what happened next. 81 seconds, 56 strikes with batons and feet. The officers believed with the complete sincerity of people applying their training to a situation their training had prepared them for, that they were managing a phencyclidine-intoxicated suspect who required this level of response. The toxicology came back. No phencyclidine, not a trace. The monster the officers believed they were fighting had never been there. What had been there was a man and a mythology. The mythology installed into their training years earlier by stories that nobody had traced to the research, by academy instructors who'd been taught by academy instructors, who'd been taught by the first wave of newspaper coverage. None of it connected to a laboratory or a peer-reviewed paper or a pharmacologist who had actually measured what the drug did. Rodney King's toxicology proved the mythology false. It didn't matter. The officers were acquitted. Los Angeles erupted. 6 days. More than 50 people dead. Over 2,000 injured. The National Guard deployed. The riots were not about one man and one beating. They were about what the beating represented. About a permission slip issued years earlier by a story nobody had checked, that had given law enforcement a specific vocabulary for a specific kind of violence and a specific kind of target, and that had been doing its work quietly for 15 years before a camcorder happened to be pointed at it. The permission slip didn't require the toxicology to be positive. The permission slip was the story. The story was the whole thing. While all of this was happening, while phencyclidine was being deployed as a permission slip in courtrooms and training manuals across America, researchers who were not reading the newspapers were noticing something strange about ketamine. Patients who received it for surgery sometimes reported feeling better afterward. Not physically better, emotionally better. Their depression was lifting. Not all patients, not consistently, but enough, and in enough cases involving patients who had not responded to anything else, that the observation was too specific to dismiss. Someone followed up. What the research found was not what anyone expected. Ketamine produces its effect on depression through the same mechanism that made phencyclidine produce emergence reactions in surgical patients 40 years earlier. The dissociation, the temporary dissolution of the normal sense of self, the disconnection between observer and observed, the feature that had terrified Park Davis and built mythology on the streets, appears to be part of how the antidepressant effect works, not a side effect to minimize or manage around. The mechanism. This is the part that takes a moment to absorb. When you are severely depressed, your sense of self has become a trap. The stories you carry about yourself, I am a failure, I am unlovable, nothing will ever change, are not separate from who you are. They are experientially what you are. They run constantly beneath every thought and every moment, and they are indistinguishable from identity. Treating them with a drug that adjusts neurotransmitter levels is like trying to renovate a house while the occupants insist they're in a different house entirely. Ketamine, at sufficient doses, temporarily takes the house offline. The self that has been building the case against itself cannot do so for an hour, because the architecture of the self is briefly not functioning in its usual form. When consciousness reassembles, when the patient comes back, as they always do, from wherever ketamine takes them, there is a window, a brief period where the stories haven't fully reinstalled themselves, where it's possible to reassemble things differently. Some patients come back from ketamine infusions and report that the depression simply isn't there, not diminished, absent, as if someone had removed it while they were gone. The FDA approved a ketamine derivative for treatment-resistant depression in 2019. Treatment-resistant. The patients who had failed every available antidepressant tried every existing option, for whom the conventional system had nothing left to offer. The same dissociation that had caused surgical patients to wake up screaming in 1958. The same disconnection that police academies have been teaching officers to respond to with maximum force since the 1970s. The same mechanism that the mythology had turned into a monster. That mechanism turned out to be the therapy. Here is what the dissociative story actually shows. Medicine was asking the right question and getting the answer wrong. The question was, how do we treat the body without the mind getting in the way? The answer was, temporarily remove the mind from the situation. Park it somewhere safe while the surgery happens. Bring it back when we're done. But the mind is not a passenger. It is not a module that can be safely parked. The self and the body are the same system, and the self's response to what happens to the body is not a complication to be managed. It is the experience. Phencyclidine removed the sensation, but not the experience of being disconnected from sensation, which turned out to be its own kind of crisis. The patients who came back screaming were not having side effects. They were having the experience of having been somewhere nobody had planned for. 60 years of dissociative history produced the same lesson in every direction. Phencyclidine taught it first. The self responds to dissociation in ways medicine cannot predict. A third of patients had emergence reactions. A coin flip, patient by patient, with no variables that could be controlled for. The street mythology taught it second. When you build a story about a drug instead of looking at the research, the story does the work of the research. But it does different work the research was designed to prevent. Ketamine's antidepressant effect taught it third. The dissociation that medicine wanted to minimize turned out to be the mechanism that made the drug useful for something nobody had anticipated. The feature was the therapy. And through all of it, medicine kept arriving at the same surprise. The self is not a manageable, bounded thing that can be worked around. It isn't. The self is the variable that kept failing to cooperate. In the surgical suite in 1958, in the police report in 1983, in the depression trial in 2015. Every time, the assumption was that the self would do what medicine expected. Every time, the self did something unexpected instead. Medicine kept filing these surprises under requires further study. The further study kept confirming the surprise. The findings kept being filed away anyway. Deliriants are the ones nobody took seriously. Deliriants are the strangest category on this list, and the least understood. Not because they're rare. The plants that produce them grow in hedgerows across Europe, along roadsides in Texas and California, in gardens and vacant lots on every inhabited continent. Not because they're weak. The experiences they produce are among the most powerful any drug can create. But because of what specifically they do, which is unlike anything in any other category. Deliriants don't alter reality. They replace it, not distort it, not intensify it, not show you something strange while leaving you aware it's strange. They replace it completely, seamlessly, without leaving any signal that the replacement has happened. The person in a delirium is not watching a light show. They're not floating outside their body. They are in a room, having a conversation, holding a cigarette. Except the room is different. The conversation is with someone who isn't there, and the cigarette doesn't exist. And they have absolutely no way to know any of that. That is what makes this category distinct from everything else. And it's why the people who understood these plants best, indigenous traditions across South America, Africa, and Asia, treated them with more caution than almost any other substance they knew. Everyone else, as we'll see, did not. Belladonna, henbane, datura. These are not obscure plants. They grow across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, in gardens and hedgerows and the gaps between fences and the roadsides of Texas and California. They have been present in human environments for as long as humans have had environments. They were not only used in ritual and witchcraft, they were used in medicine. Medieval European surgeons used preparations of belladonna and henbane as anaesthetics. The patient would drink or inhale them before an operation, producing the sedation and amnesia that made the procedure survivable. The preparation was called dwale, and it worked well enough that it was in regular use for centuries, administered by practitioners who understood its power and its danger. The understanding was there. It was specific. It was passed down. Apothecaries kept records. Physicians wrote about dosing with the same kind of careful, pragmatic knowledge the Andean healers applied to coca. Too little, and the patient suffered through the procedure. Too much, and the patient didn't survive it. The gap between a useful dose and a fatal one was narrow and required expertise to navigate. This is not a story about ignorant people stumbling around with dangerous plants. It is a story about careful people who understood a category of substance well enough to use it in surgery, and then watched that knowledge get displaced by newer chemistry, classified as folk medicine, bundled with the witch trials and the folklore and the superstition, and eventually filed under not worth serious attention. The people who understood them most thoroughly were the ones who handled them least casually. Across South America, North America, Africa, and South Asia, traditions that incorporated datura described it as extraordinarily dangerous, useful for specific ritual purposes, requiring extensive preparation, requiring guidance from someone who knew what they were doing, not to be approached casually under any circumstances. These traditions had learned this the hard way. through generations of watching what happened when people encountered the plant without preparation. The boundary between a dose that produced a meaningful ceremonial experience and a dose that produced a medical emergency was narrow and not reliably predictable. Different preparations, different individuals, different circumstances produced wildly different outcomes. The traditions that survived working with these substances were the traditions that developed extreme caution around them, that encoded that caution into ritual and restriction, and the requirement for experienced guidance. This is knowledge, specific, accumulated, tested across generations. It is the same kind of knowledge the priests of Eleusis held about psychedelics, the kind that disappears when the people who carry it are dismissed as primitive or superstitious, or simply not worth listening to. A Spanish priest in the 16th century wrote about watching someone in a datura delirium carry on an extended conversation with a wall. The wall, he noted, with some understatement, did not respond. The people who understood these plants most thoroughly were the ones who handled them least casually. In 1676, a group of British soldiers was sent to Virginia to suppress Bacon's Rebellion, a colonial uprising that had been burning through Virginia for months and had got to the point where the governor had fled Jamestown entirely. Someone, history has not definitively explained who, or exactly how, put Datura stramonium in the soldiers' food. What followed was documented by a historian named Robert Beverley, with the careful understatement of a man trying very hard not to laugh. The soldiers, he wrote, turned into what he called natural fools. They grinned at each other without apparent reason. They pawed at the air, they blew feathers about, they made faces at their commanding officers, they attempted at various points to kiss each other and to stroke the faces of their guards. They tried to put straw in a hat. They sat completely naked in a corner staring at nothing. They were, in Beverley's assessment, completely incapable of carrying out their mission. This lasted 11 days. 11 days. An entire military unit wandering the colonial Virginia landscape in a state of comprehensive delirium, unable to function in any military capacity, operating in a reality that had been replaced by datura with no consideration for the operational requirements of the rebellion they had been sent to suppress. The rebellion, meanwhile, was also effectively over. Bacon had died of dysentery a few months earlier, and the uprising had collapsed. But the soldiers had no way of knowing this, partly because they had no way of knowing much of anything for 11 days. They came back to themselves eventually, as people do when the drug clears. They remembered nothing, not the 11 days, not what they had experienced, not the faces they had made at their commanding officers. They presumably reported that the operation had proceeded adequately. There is no record of anyone asking follow-up questions. The plant they had eaten became known as Jamestown weed, Jimson weed, the name slurring over time into something less specific. It grows in the continental United States today, in fields, in vacant lots, along roadsides, pretty flowers, trumpet-shaped, white or pale purple. The plant has never shown any awareness of its history. That is, again, a human habit. The witches flew. This is worth taking seriously for a moment, because the flying part is the detail that gets dismissed, treated as superstition, as the confused belief of people who didn't understand what was happening to them. The witches hallucinated flight, we say. They believed they flew. They were wrong about the fact, but sincere about the experience. But look more carefully at what was being documented. Medieval and early modern accounts of witchcraft consistently describe the application of a preparation, usually called flying ointment, to the skin. The preparation contained belladonna, henbane, datura, and sometimes other plants from the same family, applied to areas with significant surface area and blood supply, rubbed in, left to absorb. The active compounds in these plants are absorbed transdermally. They enter the bloodstream through skin. This is known pharmacology. It is why scopolamine patches work for seasickness, why dermal absorption is a legitimate pharmaceutical delivery mechanism. The witches were not ingesting their preparation. They were absorbing it through their skin, which is a different pharmacokinetic profile, a different onset, a different quality of experience. The compounds, once absorbed, block acetylcholine. The result is delirium, the specific replacing quality of delirium, not altered reality, replaced reality. The experience included, consistently and specifically across accounts, vivid sensations of rapid movement through air, of flight, physical, detailed, specific, not a vague feeling of floating, flight. The witches were describing, as accurately as anyone could describe it, what was happening to them. The pharmacology was real. The experience was real. The compound producing it is fully characterized by modern chemistry, and its effects are well documented. A historian named Michael Harner published research in the 1970s arguing precisely this, that the witches' flight experiences were pharmacologically real, produced by the plant, preparations they were known to use, experienced as literal flight, because that is what the delirium produced. The research was published in a peer-reviewed anthropology journal. It was not what the courts of 16th century Europe were reading when they sentenced people to burn. The interpretation, that they had literally flown through the night air to gather with others at Sabbaths, was wrong in the narrow factual sense. But the experience that produced the interpretation was not imaginary, and was not a symptom of mental illness, and was not evidence of a pact with the devil. It was a transdermal belladonna preparation doing exactly what transdermal belladonna preparations do. We burned them for it. Not for taking a psychoactive plant preparation, not for being confused about what was happening to them, for reporting accurately and sincerely the experience the plant produced, for describing flight, for telling the truth about what they had felt, which had no room in any framework available to the people prosecuting them. The molecule was the evidence. The evidence got the witnesses burned. In 1946, a chemist named George Revachol, who had wanted to be an artist, was working in Cincinnati on a completely different problem. The Depression had opinions about art. Revachol became a chemist instead, specifically the kind who stayed late and tested things that probably wouldn't work on the reasonable assumption that something eventually would. He was studying muscle spasms. He was testing compounds. He found one that did something unexpected to histamine. He passed it to a pharmaceutical company. The pharmaceutical company tested it, found it effective and apparently safe, put it in a box with a flower on the label, and sold it as an allergy pill. They called it Benadryl. It worked. Genuinely, measurably, reliably. It stopped sneezing and reduced hives and cleared the particular misery of hay fever. It caused drowsiness, so people used it for sleep. It became one of the most purchased over-the-counter drugs in American history. It was cheap and available and effective and completely uncontroversial. Benadryl also turned out to be an ancestor of Prozac. The structural and conceptual work done with diphenhydramine contributed meaningfully to the development of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the most prescribed antidepressants in history. Most people on Prozac don't know they owe something to a pink allergy pill. George Revachol, who wanted to be an artist, inadvertently helped reshape how medicine treated depression. This is not in most accounts of his work. What is also not in most accounts? Benadryl belongs to the same chemical family as belladonna. Nobody at the pharmaceutical company was thinking about belladonna. Nobody was thinking about the Jamestown soldiers. Nobody was thinking about the witches. Nobody, to be clear, had any reason to be thinking about any of these things. Revachol was researching muscle spasms. The pharmaceutical company was testing antihistamines. The connection between a brand new synthetic compound and a medieval flying ointment was not the kind of thing that appeared on the agenda. But nobody was thinking about the fact that Benadryl blocks acetylcholine, the same signal that belladonna and henbane and datura block, and that at sufficient doses it produces exactly the same category of effect those plants have been producing for thousands of years. Not a psychedelic, not a dissociative, a deliriant, a replacement of reality so complete that the person inside it has no way to tell the difference. The pharmaceutical company was thinking about sneezing. They were very pleased about the sneezing. There is a specific dose of Benadryl that treats allergies, 25 milligrams, maybe 50, the pink pill, the thing that clears the sinuses and produces drowsiness, and is so familiar and unremarkable that most people keep it in the cabinet the way they keep bandages, available, unthought about, there for when it's needed. Then there is what happens above that. It is not a gradual escalation, not more of the same experience slightly amplified. It is a threshold, and past the threshold, the person is no longer having an allergy experience or a drowsiness experience. They are in delirium, the specific, replacing kind. The room they are in is real to them. The people in the room are real. The conversations are real. The cigarette in their hand that doesn't exist is real in every way their brain can evaluate. There is no observer left to notice the difference. This is what makes the deliriant experience categorically different from every other drug on this list. Psychedelics show you something extraordinary and leave you knowing the drug is responsible. Dissociatives take the self somewhere unusual and leave a residue of that strangeness on the way back. Deliriants leave nothing. There is no residue because there is no awareness of departure. The person in a delirium has not gone anywhere unusual. They are, as far as they are concerned, exactly where they are, in a perfectly normal version of reality that happens to be entirely wrong. Emergency physicians who treat anticholinergic overdose describe a specific picture. The patient is awake, appears conscious, maybe speaking fluently. But what they're speaking about has no relationship to what's actually in the room. They might be arguing with someone who isn't there, carrying out a task that exists only in the replacement reality, responding to questions that were never asked. The clinical term is agitated delirium. The experience for everyone watching is profoundly unsettling in a way that other overdoses, even very severe ones, are not. Because the patient seems present, they seem functional. The gap between how they appear and what is actually happening is wider in anticholinergic delirium than in almost any other medical presentation. And the gap between a dose that treats allergies and a dose that produces this is the same gap that has existed since 1946, when Revachel's compound went into a box with a flower on it and onto a shelf at a price anyone could afford. The appropriate channels did not include the bathroom cabinet. Most people were not in the appropriate channels. In 2020, some of them were watching 15-second videos. That was the channel the information needed to be in. It wasn't. The challenge had a specific premise. Take enough Benadryl to hallucinate. Film the results. Post it. The algorithm served it. Not maliciously. The algorithm has no malice. It has optimization targets and content about a challenge that produces dramatic visible effects on camera, generates engagement, and engagement is what the algorithm is designed to maximize. The algorithm did not know what Benadryl was. The algorithm did not know what anticholinergic delirium looks like from the inside. The algorithm served the content to people who might be interested, and some of those people were teenagers with nowhere to go during a lockdown and a medicine cabinet down the hall. A girl named Chloe Phillips died. A boy named Jacob Stevens took 12 to 14 tablets while his friends filmed him. He began convulsing almost immediately. He was admitted to intensive care. The brain scan showed nothing. His grandmother spoke to the press because she wanted people to know his name. She didn't expect it to stop the challenge. She was right not to expect it. The challenge continued, the hashtags changed, the algorithm kept running. Jacob Stevens was 13 years old. He was not reckless in the way the word usually implies. He was doing something he had seen people do online. He had no reason to believe it was as dangerous as it was, because the belief about Deliriants, that they were folklore, that they were the province of witches and shamans, that they were not real pharmacology requiring real caution, had kept the category outside the mainstream conversation about drug safety for long enough that a 13-year-old in Ohio in 2020 had no reason to know that the pink pill in the bathroom cabinet was a chemical cousin of the plant that had sent an entire British military unit wandering through Virginia for 11 days in 1676. The belief had kept the knowledge locked in folklore. Folklore doesn't reach 13-year-olds on TikTok. The warning labels on the box, and there were warning labels, there had always been warning labels, the right dose and the right cautions were printed right there, were not designed with the assumption that anyone would be taking 12 of them on purpose, on camera, as a challenge. They weren't designed for that assumption, because nobody had built the assumption into the design. After Jacob Stevens, the FDA issued a warning. Social media platforms blocked hashtags. Pharmacists put signs near the Benadryl. Parents were advised to move it to higher shelves. Johnson & Johnson, whose subsidiary owns the Benadryl brand, issued statements about responsible use. These responses were not wrong. They were calibrated for a world where adults occasionally took too much Benadryl by accident. They were not calibrated for an algorithm that had no opinion about what it was spreading, a lockdown that had put teenagers alone in their bedrooms with nothing to do, and a medicine cabinet that had never been designed with the assumption that its contents would become a trend. The molecule stayed exactly where it was, on the shelf, $4, between the cough syrup and the foot cream, available to anyone who walked in and picked it up, which is the same situation it has been in since 1946, and which nobody had found alarming until the algorithm found it first. The challenge quieted. It didn't disappear. Challenges never disappear. They just get harder to find, migrating to different platforms and different hashtags and different communities of young people who haven't seen the previous version and have no reason to know there was one. The algorithm that spread it has no memory. Each new cohort of teenagers encounters it fresh, with no institutional knowledge of what happened to the cohort before them. Erowid, the harm reduction website that had documented diphenhydramine overdose experiences since the late 90s, that had established clearly and specifically and repeatedly over 2 decades that this was not a recreational experience anyone should seek, was not what teenagers in 2020 were reading. They were watching 15-second videos. That was the channel the information needed to be in. It wasn't. The gap between the knowledge that existed and the people who needed it was not a gap anyone had designed. It was a gap that formed naturally from not taking the category seriously. Deliriants are folklore. Folklore doesn't get a public health campaign. Folklore doesn't get school curriculum. Folklore doesn't get the kind of institutional attention that would have made a 13-year-old in Ohio aware that the pink pill shared a mechanism with the plant that dismantled a British military operation for 11 days in 1676. The TikTok crisis was not the only Benadryl crisis running in 2020. It was just the visible one. Quietly in nursing homes and care facilities across America, geriatricians had been raising a different alarm about the same molecule for years. Long-term use of anticholinergic drugs, Benadryl, and the dozens of related compounds in allergy pills and sleep aids and bladder medications was accumulating in research as a risk factor for cognitive decline. A study published in 2015 by the University of Washington found that people who had taken anticholinergic drugs regularly for more than 3 years had a 50% higher risk of developing dementia than people who hadn't. 50%. The study was published in a peer-reviewed journal. Geriatricians updated their prescribing guidelines. nursing home formularies quietly changed. The medication that was on the shelf between the cough syrup and the foot cream was also on the list of drugs that doctors were now being advised to avoid in elderly patients. Nobody held a press conference about this either. No product recall, no national awareness campaign. The manufacturer did not remove the product from sale. The regulatory agencies updated their guidance. The guidance went to doctors. The doctors updated their practices slowly, in the way that medical practice updates. Institution by institution, prescription by prescription, through the slow accumulation of continuing education requirements and updated guidelines that filter through a system not designed for speed. The pill stayed on the shelf. The dementia risk accumulated in the population. The two facts coexisted without producing the kind of public reckoning that would have required someone to say, clearly, to everyone, this thing you've been treating as completely safe for 80 years is not completely safe in the ways you assumed. The same molecule. Two completely different populations. Two completely different crises running simultaneously. One loud and visible and on TikTok. One quiet and invisible and distributed across nursing home rooms across the country. Nobody connecting them publicly, because the category that produced both of them had never been taken seriously enough to generate the sustained institutional attention that would have noticed the pattern. The Benadryl is still on the shelf. The Jimson weed is still along the roadsides. The belladonna is still in the hedgerows. The plants have never needed anyone to take them seriously. That was always a human problem. The plants just kept growing.